if you can't beat them physically, is what Hamas is saying, let's try and beat them psychologically. And they managed to change a lot of things during the war. We see that they've gotten humanitarian aid, and this is something unheard of in the history of conventional warfare, where humanitarian aid is considered something that you give to your enemy. They managed to arrange having, as a result of their victimhood, their portrayal of being victims, and their inflating of figures of how many people were killed, and especially women and children, they've managed to hold up weaponry to the IDF from the United States, which was just released today, and managed to change some of the tactics that the IDF would use in the war. So this is basically psychological asymmetry, a perfect example of how it works.
My guest today is Dr. Irwin Mansdorf. He's a clinical psychologist and a fellow here at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi.
I want to talk about psychological warfare and how Hamas has so sickeningly used that tactic throughout this 15-month war. Before we get into the last events that we've witnessed for the past few weeks with the release of the hostages, I want to talk about how Hamas started this on October 7th with this psychological warfare, portraying themselves as victims, essentially. Talk to us a little bit about psychological asymmetry.
Well, psychological asymmetry means that in a conventional war, the stronger party, the militarily stronger party, usually has an advantage. But what happens with psychological asymmetry is that where the militarily stronger party has an advantage, the weaker party has a psychological advantage. And that's because they draw attention to their weakness, to their victimhood, to their suffering. And in a world where these progressive liberal values come to the forefront, this is something that you could turn into an advantage in terms of actual gains, in terms of the objectives of the war.
And it's not just a victimhood when we're talking about this psychological warfare. It's also been throughout the war playing with the emotions, of the Israeli public, specifically the families, releasing videos of hostages. In the first part of the video, they appear fine. They appear, quote unquote, fine and living under horrific circumstances. And the next slide, we see them unfortunately dead. And that's just toying with the families of the fate of their loved ones that are in captivity.
Well, there's a difference between psychological warfare and just people that are despicable human beings. And not everything that Hamas is doing has a goal to it other than just to be bad people and to hurt your enemy. The part where Hamas is trying to play with the Israeli public had to do with the hostage families, and I hesitate using the word the hostage families because there are hostage families that are like this and there are hostage families that are like that, and there are differences between them. But what they've certainly managed to accomplish by these videos is basically get the hostage families to further the political goals that they wanted in terms of an eventual deal, putting pressure on the Israeli government rather than putting pressure on themselves. And to some degree, the families fell into that trap, even by the slogan that was chosen for releasing the hostages. The slogan is not release them now. The slogan is
bring them home.
Bring them home. So that puts the onus on the Israeli government to bring them home, as if the Israeli government, and you could look at it in several ways, but the Israeli government didn't always have the ability to bring them home just by snapping their fingers.
Right. But I think on the other hand, I think the slogan, if we're talking about the slogan of bring them home, was very much, of course, Hamas carried out these atrocities on October 7th, but it was also, government and military and intelligence failures that led to the kidnapping of their loved ones. So I think also that slogan was, putting responsibility on the government. But I want to turn to the most recent psychological warfare, which we've seen in the past few weeks with the release of these female hostages first, most notably the four Gaza border spotters, those 4 young girls that were released. smiling in fresh military uniforms, waving at the crowd. They were giving gift bags, having them sign, official documents on a prop stage. I mean, it's sickening, really, when you think about it. What is Hamas attempting to do when they're creating this media circus surrounding the hostage release?
Well, they're experimenting with that, because if you remember the week before, the scene was completely different. It was bedlam, and it was masses of people seemingly trying to get to the hostages, and the women then that were released, the first women, seemed to be genuinely
terrified,
frightened and terrified coming in there. So they learned their lesson, and now they changed it the other way. So it's not necessarily deep academic psychological planning that they have over here. They tried one thing, they see what happened, and there was a lot of coverage in the media about how the bedlam, how they were standing on top of the Red Cross trucks. Now, you take a look at what happened this week, and it was completely different. It was organized, it was settled, it was like a Broadway show that was done there. So they're trying different tactics to see which way they could, again, get their image to be brandished in the most positive way possible. Now, it's also important to remember this. What they're doing is not only psychological warfare aimed at the Israeli public, it's also aimed at their own public. They're also trying to show an image of success and victory. Now, people are coming out in Gaza, and they're walking around and they're seeing the destruction. And some of them may be saying, how is this a victory? So Hamas really needs to be able to keep that, get that image really polished up. And this is something that we saw this week. Who knows what it'll be next week? Maybe a little different, because the spotters sort of like spoiled the party this week for them. They got up on stage and they were cheering, and it's been interpreted, at least on the Israeli side, as a victory for the spotters, showing their defiance in face of what they weren't bent and they weren't put down by the show.
I think that there's sort of a dissonance, though, in the way that we here in Israel view these spotters, these brave young women, right, coming on stage and giving, the victory sign. And I mean, they've said it themselves. They wanted to defy these Hamas terrorists and come out and appear strong. Like, they weren't fazed by the crowds. And for us, that's obviously comforting, seeing these young girls who, especially when they were kidnapped on October 7th, they were, so brutalized. But the way that it's being received, not in Gaza, but in the international community, is, oh, well, look, they've been treated well. And that also plays into the hands of Hamas's psychological games.
Maybe and maybe not. The scene, and when you see a masked man with a bandana on their head, this is not something that instills a lot of confidence that this is a democratic freedom fighter. Most people are scared of that, and they see that. And if Hamas wants to really achieve, and it's not that I'm trying to give
some lessons
to what Hamas should do.
Tune in to JCFA.
But that's something that is not going to work in their image. And we see that even in the demonstrations, the college demonstrations in the United States, walking around with masks and keffiyehs around their faces, not something that worked out very well for the demonstrators. Yeah. So yes, they tried to do that, but it doesn't mean that everything that's Hamas tries to do is something that they're successful in. And I think we as Israelis are a little sensitive to what they're doing, and we're saying, well, take a look what other people look at, and they're seeing they're well-fed and well-treated, and they're not necessarily going to be fooled by that. So yes, Hamas tries different psychological tactics, but it doesn't mean that they succeed all the time in what they're doing. So I think we have to tone the...
But then yet when you go on social media and you're looking at outlets like, mainstream Western outlets publishing these videos of these girls, and if you look at the comment section, really, it's so disheartening. I mean, how gullible the West is.
Well, they're gullible. We know we're going back to October 7th, almost a year and a half ago. And in the studies that we've done, we know that there are people that didn't believe that it happened. Didn't believe that anyone was brutalized, didn't believe that
even though Hamas filmed it themselves.
And remember at the beginning, people were pulling down the signs of the kidnapped hostages all over the world. So, there are people like that, and that's going to happen. So I'm not so sure that Hamas is aiming at that community, but that community was probably formed ideologically way before October 7th. And October 7th just helped them come out and express it more stronger.
What role has the media played in this psychological warfare in your
Mainstream
eyes?
or the social media? There's a difference. See, in
Let's
the
talk about
mainstream media, if you take mainstream outlets, I just read a piece today at the BBC, which you know is not one of the friends of Israel. And one sentence that they had in there was, Israel killed 47, and notice, they didn't say 47 casualties have been suffered in Gaza. They say Israel killed 47,000 Gazans, mostly women and children, according to the Hamas ministry, which has been certified by the UN as a legitimate agency. Now, we laugh at that because it's sort of like having the demon getting the approval of the devil. So, but they write that. So this is something for those that follow the BBC and take a look at it. It's going to be something that works. Now, we get into social media, and you have all kinds of influencers and all kinds of people that follow. But the same thing as social media, the people that you follow are the people that you usually believe in the first place. So what happens in terms of overall influence, it's really hard to say.
When we're talking about, we've spoken about the psychological warfare, but we also need to talk about the information warfront, because that has played an immense role in shaping this war. Israel deliberately did not publish itself the videos of the atrocities carried out by Hamas on October 7th out of respect for the families. But I'm curious to hear your opinion as to, was that a mistake in the information war? Should we have shown the world what had been done?
I tend to think that it wouldn't have made a difference, because do you really think there's anyone that doesn't realize how horrible the attack was? What this does, what it did, these videos, which I saw some of the videos, what it does is adds layers of horror to the horror that's already there. So I don't think it would be something that would have changed anyone's opinion or say, oh, now that I see this horrible thing, now I believe it happened. The things that we already put out there should have been enough for most people to follow. But it has an impact in terms of a shock effect. If you put a lot of people in a room, and these are people that are important people that you're trying to influence legislatively, for example, representatives of governments, you put them in a room and you show that in a closed
door setting, yeah.
That has an impact in terms of the group impact, without necessarily putting it out there and showing what happened to everyone else. But we realize anyone who really follows and knows what's going on knows that this was horrible. You didn't need the extra layer of horror to convince you in the first place of what happened.
In the next few weeks of this ceasefire hostage release deal, Hamas has been toying with the Israeli public. We're, breaking the ceasefire agreement numerous times, not releasing the names on time, sometimes delaying by 24 hours, sometimes saying there's been a small technical difficulty. And for the Israeli public, it really feels like we're stuck in this sort of Squid Game reality show. And it's tormenting, not just for the families, but for the entire public. In the next couple of weeks, as a psychologist, what would you advise to the Israeli public in order to not feed into that frenzy and that feeling?
Well, there's a difference between the Israeli public and those that are in the first circle of being affected, which is hostage families. The goal of Hamas is to split the Israeli public, and they've done that quite well up to now by the demonstrations that we see in the streets. For the Israeli public, it's important to be aware that this is their goal and to understand that this is what they're trying to get at. And we don't know if they ever had any intention of going to stage 2 and stage 3. We don't know what their objectives are. Are their objectives really to have a long-term ceasefire? Are their objectives just to get the people that were refugees in the south back up to the north? And now you have 1.5 million people up there. What are you going to do now? And that's enough, and they don't have to go further. If they believe that Israel is not going to renew the war, they may not go ahead and complete the deal, because this is the only cards that they have left. Once they don't have any hostages left, and especially with a Trump administration, what's going to happen? So they are trying to, and we've seen the results of that with some of the demonstrations out there. We've seen on Friday that a table was set on fire right before Shabbat with the demand that the Netanyahu government should continue to stick to the deal. We've seen people sending messages to Trump to put pressure on the Netanyahu government to complete the deal, not to put pressure on Qatar, who controls Hamas to a large degree. So to that degree, what Hamas is trying to do is working, but we don't know what their goal is. If their goal is for a permanent ceasefire, then things have a chance to go through to the end. But if their goal is just to get to a certain stage and then go back to fighting or resisting in their words, then it's a different story. This is sort of like what happened in the first hostage deal in November, where 55 were let out. There was a 2-week break, and there was a possibility to continue for another 10 days, and they didn't. They already got what they needed within those 2 weeks, and that enabled them, gave them the ability to take a deep breath and go on even further. So that's their strategy, and that's what they're trying to do. So in terms of the public has one way of looking at it, and the hostage families would have another way of looking at it. And that's something to keep in mind. We have to be very careful to understand that their goal is to split us, and we have to try very hard not to be split. But we ultimately don't know what Hamas's goals are, other than to keep us psychologically split. And that's really what they're trying to do. And they're toying with it. They'll throw it out there. They'll see what works.
Right. And I think ultimately they want to give, like you said, the Gazans the impression that Hamas has won the war, both in Gaza and also the international community, that they receive that message. But as you said, unfortunately, when those Gazans return to the northern part of the Strip and they see that most of the Strip has been completely destroyed, I don't think that Hamas will be winning any sort of favors.
That's what you would think. But this has happened before, hasn't it? They've had
but
Gaza destroyed.
Not to this scale, though.
Not to the scale, but it's happened before, and people have lost their homes, they've lost relatives, they've lost everything that they've had in their lives, and they came back, and Hamas is still in power. So Hamas's popularity, take a look at Judea and Samaria.
It's only risen by 80%.
This is something you would think, you destroyed my life, give me a chance to someone else, but that's not what they're looking for. And when I drive by the area, the Green Line, and I take a look at the villages on the other side in Judea, Samaria, on the Arab villages there, I'm not saying to myself, these are people that just want to live with us side by side in peace, and we only gave them their independence, we'd have our peace. That's what people think is an answer in the West. But that's not what the people there are thinking right now. Because if they were thinking that right now, you wouldn't have an operation in Jenin, an operation in Tulkarem, and you wouldn't find the terror that you see going on every day, and people scared even to ride the roads. So, and this is after this massive so-called genocide in Gaza. You would think that people would say, okay, it's time to make peace. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying this is something that's given us some ideological strength, and we're going to go on in our resistance. The mukawama goes on.
We saw it the very day the ceasefire came into effect, Gazans calling for October 7th to happen again and again and again and again. We can sit here and talk about psychological warfare for hours, but Dr. Irwin Mansdorf, I think we'll call it an end here, and we'll definitely be talking about this more in the next coming weeks.
Pleasure.
Thank you.